The world that emerged from the ashes of World War II was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The Holocaust had shattered comfortable assumptions about human progress and moral development. The atomic bomb had demonstrated humanity's capacity for unprecedented destruction. The Cold War had divided the world into competing ideological camps. In this transformed landscape, philosophy too would undergo dramatic changes, developing new methods, asking new questions and reaching new conclusions about knowledge, reality and human society. The period from 1950 to 1980 would prove to be one of the most fertile and revolutionary in the history of philosophy. In the English-speaking world, analytic philosophy reached new levels of sophistication and rigor, while continental philosophy continued to explore the depths of human experience and social reality. The philosophy of science was revolutionized by new insights into how scientific knowledge actually develops. Political philosophy experienced a remarkable renaissance after decades of relative neglect. And throughout this period, the split between analytic and continental traditions would become increasingly pronounced, creating two distinct philosophical cultures that often seem to inhabit different worlds. Analytic philosophy matures. By 1950, analytic philosophy had established itself as the dominant approach in British and American universities. The movement that had begun with Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore's revolt against idealism had evolved through logical positivism into a sophisticated tradition focused on clarity, precision and logical rigor. But even as analytic philosophy achieved institutional dominance, it was being transformed from within by a new generation of thinkers who questioned some of its most fundamental assumptions. The most influential of these internal critics was Willard Van Orman Quine, universally known as W.V.O. Quine, who was born in 1908 in Akron, Ohio. Quine came from a modest middle-class family and showed early promise in mathematics and logic. He studied at Oberlin College and then at Harvard, where he wrote his dissertation on mathematical logic under Alfred North Whitehead. Quine would spend virtually his entire career at Harvard, becoming one of the most respected and influential philosophers of the 20th century. Quine's revolutionary impact on philosophy came through a seemingly technical paper published in 1951 titled Two Dogmas of Empiricism. In this paper, Quine challenged two fundamental assumptions that had guided empiricist philosophy since the time of Hume. The first dogma was the distinction between analytic and synthetic statements. Analytic statements like all bachelors are unmarried were supposed to be true by definition, while synthetic statements like the cat is on the mat were supposed to be true or false based on empirical evidence. The second dogma was reductionism, the idea that each meaningful statement could be reduced to statements about immediate experience. Quine argued that both of these distinctions were untenable. He showed that there was no clear criterion for distinguishing between analytic and synthetic statements. Even seemingly obvious analytic truths like no bachelor is married could be revised if we had sufficient reason to do so. The meaning of our words and the truth of our beliefs form an interconnected web where any part can be revised in light of new experience. This led Quine to his famous thesis of the underdetermination of theory by evidence. Any given set of observations could be consistent with multiple theories about the world, and we choose between theories based on pragmatic considerations like simplicity and utility rather than on purely logical grounds. This insight had profound implications for our understanding of knowledge and science. If there are no statements that are immune from revision, then even our most basic logical and mathematical principles could theoretically be abandoned if doing so would help us better organize our experience. Science is not a matter of discovering eternal truths, but of constructing useful tools for predicting and controlling our environment. This view, which became known as holistic empiricism, would influence virtually every area of analytic philosophy. Quine also made groundbreaking contributions to the philosophy of language and mind. His thought experiment about radical translation showed that there could be multiple, equally valid ways of translating between languages, leading to his thesis of the indeterminacy of translation. When an anthropologist encounters a completely foreign language, they might observe a native speaker pointing at a rabbit and saying "gavagai." But does "gavagai" mean rabbit, undetached rabbit part, or temporal stage of a rabbit? Quine argued that there is no fact of the matter that could determine which translation is correct. This insight suggested that meaning itself might be less determinate than philosophers had traditionally assumed. Donald Davidson, born in 1917 in Springfield, Massachusetts, was deeply influenced by Quine's work but developed it in new directions. Davidson studied at Harvard and was a student of Quine's, but he became fascinated with questions about the nature of mind and language that Quine had largely set aside. Davidson's most famous contribution was his theory of radical interpretation, which explored how we could understand the speech and behavior of others without assuming any shared background of beliefs and meanings. Davidson argued that interpretation requires what he called the principle of charity. When trying to understand what another person means by their words, we must assume that most of their beliefs are true and that their reasoning is largely rational. This is not because people are actually always rational, but because without this assumption, interpretation would be impossible. If we assumed that most of someone's beliefs were false, or that their reasoning was completely irrational, we would have no way of figuring out what they meant by their words. This insight led Davidson to develop an influential theory of mind known as anomalous monism. Davidson argued that mental events are identical to physical events in the brain, but that there are no strict laws connecting mental and physical descriptions. The mental and physical are two different ways of describing the same events, neither of which can be reduced to the other. This position allowed Davidson to maintain that the mind is part of the natural world while preserving the autonomy of psychological explanation. Davidson's work on the nature of truth and meaning was equally influential. He developed a sophisticated theory based on the work of the logician Alfred Tarski, arguing that a theory of meaning for a language should take the form of a theory of truth. To know the meaning of a sentence is to know the conditions under which it would be true. This seemingly technical insight had broad implications for how we understand communication and understanding. Perhaps the most revolutionary figure in analytic philosophy during this period was Saul Kripke, born in 1940 in Bayshore, New York. Kripke was something of a prodigy, making important contributions to modal logic while still in high school and publishing groundbreaking papers before he had finished his undergraduate degree at Harvard. His work would fundamentally transform how philosophers thought about necessity, possibility, and the relationship between language and reality. Kripke's most famous contribution came in a series of lectures delivered at Princeton in 1970, later published as Naming and Necessity. In these lectures, Kripke challenged fundamental assumptions about how names and descriptions work. Traditional theories, going back to Frege and Russell, had assumed that proper names like Aristotle work by expressing descriptions like the student of Plato who taught Alexander the Great. Kripke argued that this could not be right. Instead, Kripke proposed that names are rigid designators that refer to the same object in all possible worlds where that object exists. When we use the name Aristotle, we are referring to a specific individual, not to whoever happens to satisfy certain descriptions. This might seem like a technical point, but it had revolutionary implications. It meant that some truths about the world are necessary, even though we can only discover them through empirical investigation. Water is H2O is necessarily true, but we had to do chemistry to discover it. Kripke's work on possible world semantics provided a powerful new tool for analyzing concepts like necessity, possibility, and knowledge. Possible worlds are ways things could have been or might be. A statement is necessarily true if it is true in all possible worlds, possibly true if it is true in at least one possible world, and contingent if it is true in some possible worlds, but not others. This framework allowed philosophers to give precise analyses of concepts that had previously been quite vague. The development of analytic philosophy during this period was also marked by increasing attention to cases and examples that tested philosophical theories. The most famous of these was the Gettier problem, named after Edmond Gettier, who in 1963 published a short paper that challenged the traditional definition of knowledge. Since ancient times, philosophers had generally agreed that knowledge could be defined as justified true belief. To know something, you had to believe it, it had to be true, and you had to have good reasons for believing it. Gettier showed that this definition was inadequate by constructing ingenious counterexamples. Suppose Smith believes that Jones owns a Ford because he has seen Jones driving a Ford every day for years. Smith also believes that either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Boston. Since this follows logically from his belief that Jones owns a Ford. But it turns out that Jones does not actually own a Ford. He has been renting it. However, by sheer coincidence, Brown really is in Boston. So Smith has a justified true belief that either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Boston, but intuitively he does not know this. The Gettier problem sparked decades of debate as philosophers tried to find a better definition of knowledge. Some argued that knowledge requires that your belief be connected to the truth in the right way. Others claimed that knowledge requires that your belief be based on a method that is reliable in the actual world. Still, others argued that knowledge requires that your belief would remain true, even if circumstances were slightly different. The debate continues to this day, illustrating how apparently simple philosophical concepts can turn out to be remarkably complex. Philosophy of science revolutionized. While analytic philosophers were refining their methods and questioning their assumptions, the philosophy of science was undergoing its own revolution. The logical positivist picture of science as a cumulative enterprise that gradually approached truth through careful observation and logical inference was being challenged by historically informed studies of how science actually develops. The most influential critic of the positivist view was Thomas Kuhn, born in 1922 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Kuhn initially studied physics at Harvard, writing his dissertation on theoretical physics under the direction of the renowned physicist John van Vleck. But Kuhn became increasingly interested in the history of science, partly through his involvement in a general education course on the history of science that Harvard introduced after the war. Kuhn's revolutionary insight came from his detailed study of the history of astronomy, physics, and chemistry. He noticed that the development of science did not follow the smooth, cumulative pattern that philosophers had described. Instead, science seemed to go through periods of revolutionary change in which fundamental assumptions were overthrown and replaced with entirely new ways of thinking about the world. This observation led Kuhn to develop his famous theory of paradigm shifts, which he presented in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, published in 1962. A paradigm, in Kuhn's technical sense, is a complete way of practicing science that includes not just theories but also methods, standards, and exemplary solutions to problems. The paradigm defines what counts as a legitimate scientific problem, what methods are appropriate for solving it, and what kind of solution would be acceptable. Most of the time, scientists work within an established paradigm, engaging in what Kuhn called normal science. Normal science is like puzzle solving, where the basic framework is taken for granted and scientists focus on working out the details. When normal science encounters anomalies, problems that cannot be solved within the existing paradigm, scientists typically try to modify the paradigm to accommodate them. But sometimes the anomalies accumulate to the point where the paradigm itself comes into question. This leads to what Kuhn called a scientific revolution, a period of crisis in which the old paradigm is abandoned and replaced with a new one. The shift from Newtonian physics to Einstein's relativity theory was one such revolution. The old and new paradigms are incommensurable, meaning that they cannot really be compared directly because they involve different ways of seeing the world. Kuhn's most controversial claim was that scientific revolutions are not purely rational processes. Scientists do not abandon old paradigms simply because new ones explain the evidence better. Instead, paradigm shifts involve a kind of conversion experience in which scientists begin to see the world differently. The new paradigm is not necessarily more accurate than the old one. It is simply different. This view challenged the traditional image of science as an objective, rational enterprise that gradually approaches truth. If scientific knowledge is paradigm relative, then it is not clear that science is really progressing towards a better understanding of objective reality. Scientists working within different paradigms might be studying essentially different worlds. Kuhn's work sparked intense debate among philosophers and scientists. Some embraced his insights about the social and historical dimensions of scientific knowledge. Others worried that his views led to a dangerous relativism that undermined the authority of science. The debate continues to influence discussions about the nature of scientific knowledge and its relationship to truth. An even more radical critique of traditional philosophy of science came from Paul Feyerabend, born in 1924 in Vienna, Austria. Feyerabend studied physics and philosophy at the University of Vienna, where he was influenced by the logical positivist tradition. But his views changed dramatically after he encountered the work of Karl Popper and began to study the history of science in detail. Feyerabend argued that there is no such thing as the scientific method. Scientists use whatever methods work, and the methods that work in one context may be completely inappropriate in another. Great scientists like Galileo succeeded not by following established methodological rules, but by breaking them. Galileo used rhetorical tricks, appealed to aesthetic considerations, and sometimes simply ignored evidence that contradicted his theories. This led Feyerabend to embrace what he called epistemological anarchism. There are no universal methodological rules that scientists should follow. The only principle that can be consistently applied is anything goes. This did not mean that Feyerabend thought science was irrational or that all theories are equally good. Rather, he argued that the creativity and flexibility that make science successful cannot be captured in rigid methodological rules. Feyerabend's most famous work, Against Method, published in 1975, argued that methodological rules actually hinder scientific progress. He showed through detailed historical case studies that scientific advances often require violating the very methodological principles that philosophers claim are essential to science. The history of science is not a story of the triumph of reason over superstition, but rather a complex narrative in which rational and irrational elements are inextricably intertwined. Feyerabend also argued that the dominance of science in modern society is a form of intellectual imperialism. Science has been so successful that it has crowded out other ways of understanding the world, but there is no reason to think that scientific knowledge is the only kind of knowledge worth having. Traditional cultures, art and religion offer insights that science cannot provide. And a truly free society would allow different traditions of knowledge to compete on equal terms. A more moderate but still influential critique of positivist philosophy of science came from Imre Lakatos, born in 1922 in Hungary. Lakatos studied mathematics and physics at the University of Debrecen and later at Cambridge, where he worked with Georg Polya on the philosophy of mathematics. Lakatos was deeply influenced by Popper's emphasis on falsifiability, but he thought Popper's account of scientific method was too simple. Lakatos argued that scientists do not test isolated theories, but rather research programs that consist of a core of fundamental assumptions surrounded by a protective belt of auxiliary hypotheses. When a research program encounters contradictory evidence, scientists typically modify the auxiliary hypotheses rather than abandoning the core. This is perfectly rational, because the core of a research program often contains the most powerful and successful ideas. Research programs can be progressive or degenerating. A progressive research program successfully predicts new phenomena and leads to new discoveries. A degenerating research program merely accommodates known facts without making new predictions. Lakatos argued that scientists should work within progressive research programs and abandon degenerating ones, but this process can take decades or even centuries. Lakatos's account of scientific rationality was more nuanced than Popper's, but avoided the relativistic implications of Kuhn's work. Science is rational, but scientific rationality is more complex and historically extended than philosophers had previously recognized. Scientists are rational to stick with promising research programs even when they face temporary difficulties, but they are also rational to abandon programs that consistently fail to deliver new insights. The Copernican revolution provided a perfect case study for testing these different theories about scientific change. Ptolemy's geocentric astronomy had been successful for over 1,000 years, making accurate predictions about the positions of planets and stars. Copernicus's heliocentric theory initially made worse predictions and violated common-sense assumptions about motion and perception. Why did astronomers eventually accept it? From Kuhn's perspective, the Copernican revolution was a classic paradigm shift. The geocentric and heliocentric theories were incommensurable ways of seeing the world. Astronomers converted to the heliocentric view not because it was obviously better, but because a new generation of scientists began to see the world differently. From Lakatos's perspective, heliocentrism was part of a progressive research program that eventually proved more fruitful than the degenerating Ptolemaic program. From Feyerabend's perspective, Copernicus succeeded by violating established methodological rules and using rhetorical and aesthetic considerations rather than purely empirical ones. Each of these accounts captures something important about the Copernican revolution, but none provides a complete explanation. This suggests that the nature of scientific change is more complex than any single theory can capture. Political philosophy, Renaissance. While philosophy of science was being revolutionized by historical and sociological insights, political philosophy was experiencing its own renaissance after decades of relative neglect. The horrors of World War II and the challenges of the Cold War had made questions about justice, equality, and legitimate government seem urgently important once again. The most influential figure in this revival was John Rawls, born in 1921 in Baltimore, Maryland. Rawls came from a comfortable middle-class family and was educated at Princeton, where he studied moral and political philosophy. He served in the Pacific Theater during World War II, an experience that deepened his commitment to understanding the foundations of justice and human rights. Rawls' masterwork, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, provided the most systematic and influential theory of justice since the classical period. Rawls was troubled by the fact that political philosophy had become dominated by utilitarian thinking, which seemed to allow the sacrifice of individual rights for the greater good. He wanted to develop a theory that would take individual rights seriously while still providing guidance about how to organize society. Rawls's central insight was to ask what principles of justice people would choose if they did not know their place in society. He imagined a hypothetical original position in which people would choose principles of justice from behind a veil of ignorance that prevented them from knowing their race, gender, social class, natural talents, or even their conception of the good life. In this position, people would have to choose principles that they could live with no matter what position they ended up occupying in society. Rawls argued that people in the original position would choose two principles of justice. First, each person should have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberties compatible with similar liberties for others. Second, social and economic inequalities should be arranged so that they are both to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged and attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. The first principle establishes basic rights like freedom of speech, religion, and political participation that cannot be traded away for economic benefits. The second principle, known as the difference principle, allows inequalities only if they benefit the worst-off members of society. This means that a society with significant inequality could be just if that inequality resulted from incentives that encouraged productive activity that ultimately benefited everyone, including the poor. Rawls's theory had enormous influence on political philosophy, law, and public policy. It provided a systematic framework for thinking about distributive justice that went beyond simple utilitarianism while avoiding the pitfalls of purely libertarian approaches. The theory seemed to capture many people's intuitive sense that a just society should be one that takes seriously both individual liberty and concern for the disadvantaged. But Rawls's theory also attracted serious criticism, most notably from Robert Nozick, born in 1938 in Brooklyn, New York. Nozick studied philosophy at Columbia, Oxford, and Princeton, where he wrote his dissertation on decision theory. He was deeply influenced by libertarian political philosophy and Austrian economics, and he saw Rawls's theory as a sophisticated threat to individual liberty. Nozick's response came in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, published in 1974. Nozick argued that any theory of distributive justice that focuses on end-state patterns of distribution will necessarily violate individual rights. If we try to maintain a particular distribution of goods, we will have to interfere with people's voluntary choices about how to use their talents and resources. Nozick illustrated this with his famous example of the basketball player Wilt Chamberlain. Suppose we start with the distribution of goods that satisfies Rawls's principles of justice. Now suppose that people are willing to pay to watch Chamberlain play basketball, and over the course of a season he becomes much wealthier than others. Is this new distribution unjust? Nozick argued that it cannot be, because it arose from the voluntary choices of individuals who were entitled to the resources they used to pay Chamberlain. This led Nozick to develop what he called an entitlement theory of justice. A distribution is just if it arose from just acquisitions and just transfers. People are entitled to their holdings if they acquired them without violating anyone else's rights, or if they received them from someone who was legitimately entitled to transfer them. The role of government should be limited to protecting these entitlements and providing a framework for voluntary exchange. Nozick's theory implied that most of the redistributive activities of the modern welfare state are unjust. Taxation for redistribution is a form of forced labour because it compels people to work for the benefit of others. The only legitimate functions of government are to protect people from force, fraud and theft, and to enforce contracts. The debate between Rawls and Nozick revitalized political philosophy and established the terms that would guide much subsequent discussion. Are we primarily concerned with ensuring that everyone has access to the resources they need to live a decent life? Or are we primarily concerned with protecting individual liberty and voluntary exchange? Can these values be reconciled, or must we choose between them? The debate also raised fundamental questions about the nature of property rights and distributive justice. Rawls's theory seemed to assume that natural talents and social circumstances are morally arbitrary, so the goods that flow from them should be distributed according to principles that everyone could accept. Nozick's theory seemed to assume that people have strong rights to the fruits of their labour and voluntary exchange, even if this leads to significant inequalities. Both theories face challenges from other directions. Feminist philosophers argued that both Rawls and Nozick ignored the family and the gendered division of labour that shapes people's opportunities and life prospects. Communitarian philosophers argued that both theories were too individualistic and failed to recognize the importance of community and shared values. Socialist philosophers argued that both theories failed to address the fundamental problems created by capitalist economic relations. But the revival of normative political theory that Rawls and Nozick initiated was enormously influential. Political philosophers began to take seriously the task of developing systematic theories of justice and applying them to practical problems. The field became more rigorous and sophisticated, drawing on insights from economics, psychology, and other social sciences, while maintaining its commitment to fundamental questions about how we should live together. Continental philosophy continues. While analytic philosophy was developing in the English-speaking world, continental philosophy continued to evolve in Europe, exploring themes of embodiment, intersubjectivity, and the interpretation of meaning. Three figures stand out as particularly influential during this period: Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Emmanuel Levinas, and Hans-Georg Gadamer. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, born in 1908 in Rochefort-sur-Mer, France, grew up in a world marked by the First World War and the social upheavals that followed. He studied philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where he encountered the phenomenological movement that had been initiated by Husserl and developed by Heidegger. But Merleau-Ponty became convinced that phenomenology needed to take the bodily dimension of human experience. Merleau-Ponty's central insight was that perception is not a passive reception of sensory data, but an active engagement with the world through our embodied being. We do not first have sensations and then interpret them. Rather, we are always already engaged with meaningful environments through our bodily skills and habits. When we reach for a glass of water, we do not first calculate its distance and then move our hand. Our body knows how to reach for it through years of practice. This embodied knowledge is not conceptual, but practical. We know how to walk, how to ride a bicycle, how to recognize faces, not through explicit rules, but through bodily skills that we have developed through interaction with the world. Merleau-Ponty called this motor intentionality to distinguish it from the cognitive intentionality that Husserl had emphasized. This insight had profound implications for understanding perception, knowledge, and the relationship between mind and world. Traditional philosophy had assumed that perception involves a passive subject receiving information about an objective world. But Merleau-Ponty argued that perception is always perspectival, always from a particular bodily position, and always involves the active exploration of the world through movement and touch. Merleau-Ponty illustrated this with his famous analysis of depth perception. How do we see that one object is farther away than another? Traditional theories suggested that we calculate depth from cues like the relative size of objects or the convergence of our eyes, but Merleau-Ponty argued that depth is not calculated but directly perceived through our embodied engagement with the world. Depth is the dimension along which objects are arrayed for a body that moves through space. This analysis extended to all aspects of perception. Colour is not a property of objects, but a quality that emerges from the interaction between light, objects, and our embodied visual system. The redness of a tomato is not simply there in the tomato, nor is it simply in our mind. It emerges from the relationship between our embodied being and the world. Merleau-Ponty's later work explored the implications of this insight for understanding language, art, and social relations. He argued that meaning is not primarily conceptual, but embodied, rooted in our bodily engagement with the world and with others. Language does not simply represent pre-existing thoughts, but is a form of embodied action that creates meaning through its performance. Emanuel Levinas, born in 1906 in Kaunas, Lithuania, brought a very different perspective to continental philosophy. Levinas came from a Lithuanian Jewish family and was educated in the traditional Jewish texts, as well as in modern European philosophy. He studied in France and Germany, encountering the work of Husserl and Heidegger. But the Holocaust, during which most of his family was murdered, profoundly influenced his philosophical development. Levinas became convinced that Western philosophy had failed to grapple adequately with the ethical dimension of human existence. From the Greeks through Heidegger, philosophy had been concerned primarily with understanding being, with grasping and comprehending the world. But this emphasis on understanding and control had made it possible to treat other human beings as objects to be manipulated rather than as subjects deserving of respect. Levinas argued that ethics must be first philosophy, more fundamental than ontology or epistemology. The most basic human experience is not our relationship to being, but our encounter with the face of another person. When we truly encounter another person, we are confronted with their vulnerability and need, and we are called to respond with responsibility and care. The face of the other is not simply a physical object, but a demand for ethical response. It says to us, in effect, "Thou shalt not kill," but more broadly it calls us to recognize the other as a person who deserves respect and care. This encounter with the other is asymmetrical. We are infinitely responsible for the other, but we cannot demand the same responsibility in return. This insight led Levinas to develop a radical critique of Western philosophy's emphasis on totality and system. The ethical encounter with the other breaks open any attempt to create a complete philosophical system. The other is irreducible to our categories and concepts. They remain forever mysterious and beyond our complete understanding. Levinas's work was deeply influenced by his reading of Jewish texts, particularly the Talmud, which he saw as embodying a different approach to wisdom than Greek philosophy. Where Greek philosophy seeks to understand and master reality through concepts, Jewish thought emphasizes the practical wisdom that comes from living in relationship with others and with God. The influence of Levinas's work extended far beyond philosophy. His emphasis on the primacy of ethics influenced theology, political theory, and cultural criticism. He provided a philosophical foundation for understanding human rights and dignity that did not depend on abstract principles but on the concrete encounter with vulnerable others. Hans-Georg Gadamer, born in 1900 in Marburg, Germany, lived through both world wars and the rise and fall of Nazi Germany. He studied philosophy under Martin Heidegger and was deeply influenced by Heidegger's analysis of human existence as essentially historical and interpretive. But Gadamer developed these insights in a different direction, creating a philosophical hermeneutics that explored how understanding and interpretation work. Gadamer's central insight was that all understanding is interpretive and historically conditioned. We never approach texts, events, or other people from a neutral, objective standpoint. Instead, we always bring our own horizon of assumptions, values, and expectations to any encounter with something foreign or unfamiliar. This might seem to lead to relativism, but Gadamer argued that interpretation is not arbitrary. When we encounter something that challenges our expectations, we are forced to revise our understanding. True understanding involves what Gadamer called a fusion of horizons, where our own horizon and that of the text or person we are trying to understand are both transformed through the encounter. Gadamer illustrated this with the example of understanding a historical text. We cannot simply transport ourselves back to the author's time and see things exactly as they did. Our historical distance from the text is not an obstacle to understanding, but a condition that makes understanding possible. We can see aspects of the text's meaning that were not visible to the author's contemporaries, while the text can challenge and transform our contemporary assumptions. This process of interpretation involves what Gadamer called play. Like players in a game, interpreters must follow certain rules and respond to what emerges in the course of the interpretive process. But also like play, interpretation is creative and open-ended. There is no single correct interpretation of a text, but this does not mean that all interpretations are equally valid. Gadamer's hermeneutics had broad implications for the human sciences and for our understanding of cultural and historical knowledge. It suggested that the natural science model of objective, universal knowledge is inappropriate for understanding human actions, institutions, and cultural products. The human sciences require a different kind of knowledge that takes seriously the interpretive and historical character of human existence. The period from 1950 to 1980 thus saw remarkable developments in both analytic and continental philosophy. Analytic philosophy became more sophisticated and self-critical, questioning its own assumptions while developing new tools for understanding language, mind, and knowledge. Continental philosophy continued to explore the existential and hermeneutical dimensions of human experience while developing new insights into embodiment, ethics, and interpretation. The split between these traditions became increasingly pronounced during this period. Analytic philosophers often dismissed continental philosophy as obscure and unrigorous, while continental philosophers criticized analytic philosophy as narrow and scientistic. This division would have lasting consequences for the development of philosophy, creating two distinct philosophical cultures that often seemed to have little to say to each other. Yet both traditions were responding to the same fundamental challenges posed by the modern world. How to understand knowledge in a post-positivist age, how to think about human agency and responsibility in light of scientific discoveries about the mind and society, and how to ground ethical and political judgment in a pluralistic world. Their different approaches to these challenges enriched philosophy and provided resources for addressing the complex problems of the contemporary world. The postmodern challenge. The student uprising of May 1968 in Paris began as a protest against university reforms, but it quickly exploded into something much larger and more profound. Young people occupied universities, workers went on strike across France, and for a brief moment it seemed as if the entire social order might collapse. The revolutionaries scrawled graffiti on the walls of the Sorbonne that captured the spirit of the times. It is forbidden to forbid, and be realistic, demand the impossible. This moment of rebellion was not just political but intellectual, marking the emergence of a new kind of thinking that would challenge the very foundations of Western philosophy and culture. The events of 1968 were both symptom and catalyst of a broader transformation in intellectual life. The grand narratives that had sustained Western civilization for centuries, from Christianity to Marxism to liberal progress, were beginning to lose their power to convince. The horrors of 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and the growing awareness of colonialism and oppression had shattered faith in human reason and moral progress. A new generation of thinkers was emerging who questioned not just particular ideas, but the entire framework of Western thought. This intellectual revolution would come to be known as postmodernism, though, like many philosophical movements, it was more a loose collection of related ideas than a unified doctrine. The postmodern thinkers shared a skepticism toward grand theories, universal truths and stable meanings. They were suspicious of claims to objective knowledge and interested in exploring how power relationships shaped what counted as truth. Most importantly, they challenged the assumption that Western philosophy represented the pinnacle of human rational achievement, opening up space for previously marginalized voices and perspectives. French post-structuralism. The intellectual roots of postmodernism can be traced to a group of French thinkers who emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. These philosophers, often grouped together under the label post-structuralism, shared a commitment to questioning the stable structures and binary oppositions that had long dominated Western thought. They were influenced by earlier thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who had proclaimed the death of God and challenged the foundations of morality, and Martin Heidegger, who had questioned the entire tradition of Western metaphysics. Michel Foucault was perhaps the most influential of these post-structuralist thinkers. Born in 1926 in Poitiers, France, Foucault grew up in a middle-class family that expected him to follow his father into medicine. But the young Foucault was more interested in philosophy and history, and he was deeply troubled by his own homosexuality in a society that criminalized and pathologized same-sex desire. These personal struggles would later inform his intellectual work on the relationship between power, knowledge, and sexuality. Foucault's great insight was that knowledge and power are intimately connected in ways that previous thinkers had not fully appreciated. Rather than seeing knowledge as a neutral tool for discovering truth, Foucault argued that what counts as knowledge is always shaped by relations of power. Those who have the authority to speak, to define what is normal and abnormal, to classify and categorize human behavior, are exercising a form of power that is often invisible, but enormously influential. This led Foucault to develop what he called an archaeology of knowledge, a method for uncovering the hidden assumptions and power relations that shape different historical periods. Instead of looking for continuous progress in human understanding, Foucault examined the sudden breaks and discontinuities in how people thought about madness, sexuality, punishment, and other aspects of human experience. He showed how what we take to be natural and inevitable categories are actually historical constructions that serve particular interests. Foucault's analysis of the birth of the modern prison system provides a perfect example of his method. In his book Discipline and Punish, published in 1975, Foucault traced the transformation of punishment from public spectacle to private rehabilitation. In the 18th century, criminals were tortured and executed in public squares, with crowds gathering to witness the sovereign's power over life and death. But by the 19th century, this system had been replaced by the modern prison, where criminals were isolated, observed, and supposedly reformed through disciplinary techniques. Most people would see this transformation as humanitarian progress, a move from barbaric cruelty to enlightened rehabilitation. But Foucault argued that the new system was actually more insidious than the old one. The public execution was terrible, but limited in scope and time. The modern prison, by contrast, created a form of power that was continuous, invisible, and all-pervasive. The criminal was subjected to constant surveillance and discipline, not just for a few hours of punishment, but for years of imprisonment. Moreover, Foucault showed how the techniques developed in prisons soon spread throughout society. The same methods of observation, classification, and normalization were applied in schools, hospitals, factories, and other institutions. Modern society became what Foucault called a disciplinary society, where people learned to monitor and control their own behavior according to norms established by experts and authorities. The famous example Foucault used to illustrate this transformation was Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, a prison design where a single guard in a central tower could observe all the prisoners in their cells without being seen himself. The prisoners never knew when they were being watched, so they had to assume they were always under surveillance. This created what Foucault called disciplinary power, a form of control that operated not through force, but through the internalization of norms and the constant possibility of observation. Foucault argued that modern society had become like a vast panopticon where people disciplined themselves according to standards of normality established by psychology, medicine, education, and other human sciences. We learn to see ourselves as the experts see us, measuring our behavior against statistical norms and seeking to correct any deviations. This form of power is more effective than direct coercion because it makes people complicit in their own control. Jacques Derrida, another central figure in French post-structuralism, was born in Algeria in 1930 to a Sephardic Jewish family. He experienced firsthand the effects of anti-Semitic laws during World War II, when Jewish students were expelled from schools and subjected to quotas and restrictions. This early encounter with exclusion and marginalization would deeply influence his later philosophical work on the violence of conceptual systems and the importance of what gets left out or suppressed. Derrida's contribution to postmodern thought was the development of deconstruction, a method of reading that reveals the internal contradictions and instabilities in seemingly coherent texts and concepts. Deconstruction is not simply a form of criticism or interpretation, but a way of showing how meaning is always unstable and how texts inevitably undermine their own explicit claims. Derrida's target was what he called the metaphysics of presence, the assumption that has dominated Western philosophy since Plato, that reality consists of stable, self-identical things that can be fully present to consciousness. This metaphysics privileges speech over writing, presence over absence, identity over difference, and the centre over the margin. Derrida argued that this entire system of thought was based on a series of violent exclusions that suppressed the very differences and instabilities that made meaning possible in the first place. To understand Derrida's argument, consider the relationship between speech and writing. Western philosophy has traditionally seen speech as more authentic than writing because when we speak, we seem to be immediately present to our meaning. Writing, by contrast, is seen as a mere representation of speech, a secondary copy that is always at risk of being misunderstood or misinterpreted. But Derrida argued that this hierarchy is backwards. Writing actually reveals the true nature of all language, including speech. When we write something down, we create marks that can be read by others in our absence. The meaning of writing does not depend on the presence of the author, but on the reader's ability to interpret the marks according to conventional rules. But Derrida pointed out that speech works the same way. When we speak, we use words that we did not invent, following grammatical rules that exist independently of our intentions. The words we speak can be repeated by others in different contexts, taking on new meanings that we never intended. This led Derrida to his famous claim that there is nothing outside the text. This statement is often misunderstood as meaning that reality does not exist, or that everything is just language. But Derrida's point was more subtle. He was arguing that we never have access to pure, unmediated reality, but always encounter the world through systems of signs and differences that are structured like language. Even our most immediate experiences are shaped by conceptual frameworks that we inherit from our culture and history. Deconstruction reveals how these conceptual frameworks are unstable and contradictory. Every concept depends on its opposite for its meaning. We cannot understand light without darkness, presence without absence, good without evil. But this means that each concept contains within itself the trace of what it excludes. Deconstruction follows these traces to show how texts and concepts undermine their own claims to stability and coherence. Jean-François Lyotard, born in 1924, provided perhaps the most influential analysis of what came to be called the postmodern condition. Trained as a philosopher, Lyotard was initially attracted to Marxism and participated in leftist political groups. But he became increasingly disillusioned with grand political theories and turned his attention to the changing nature of knowledge and culture in advanced industrial societies. Lyotard's book The Postmodern Condition, published in 1979, began with a famous definition: "I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives." Meta-narratives are the grand stories that societies tell about themselves to justify their institutions and practices. The Enlightenment told a story about the progress of reason and the gradual liberation of humanity from ignorance and superstition. Christianity told a story about salvation and redemption. Marxism told a story about the inevitable triumph of the working class and the achievement of a classless society. But Lyotard argued that these grand narratives had lost their credibility in the postmodern era. The horrors of the 20th century had shown that reason could be used for domination as well as liberation. The failure of actually existing socialist states had undermined confidence in Marxist promises. Even the liberal narrative of progress seemed doubtful in the face of environmental destruction, nuclear weapons, and persistent inequality. In place of these grand narratives, Lyotard saw the emergence of a multiplicity of smaller, local narratives or language games. Each community, profession, or group has its own ways of making sense of the world, its own criteria for what counts as valid knowledge, its own goals and values. These different language games cannot be reduced to a single overarching system because they follow different rules and serve different purposes. This fragmentation of knowledge and culture was both liberating and troubling. On the one hand, it opened up space for previously marginalized voices and perspectives. Groups that had been excluded from the dominant narratives could now tell their own stories and develop their own forms of knowledge. On the other hand, it raised difficult questions about how different communities could communicate with each other and how societies could make collective decisions without shared values and goals. Gilles Deleuze, working often in collaboration with Félix Guattari, developed another influential critique of traditional Western thought. Born in 1925, Deleuze was trained in the history of philosophy but became increasingly interested in developing new concepts and ways of thinking that could escape the limitations of traditional philosophical categories. Deleuze and Guattari's most famous concept was the rhizome, which they contrasted with tree-like or hierarchical forms of organization. Trees have roots, trunks and branches arranged in a clear hierarchy from bottom to top. Similarly, traditional thought tends to be organized around central concepts, foundational principles and systematic classifications that arrange everything in a neat order. But rhizomes, like grass or mushroom networks, spread horizontally in all directions without a clear center or hierarchy. Any point in a rhizome can connect to any other point, creating multiple pathways and connections. Deleuze and Guattari argued that thought and reality are more like rhizomes than trees, characterized by multiplicity, connection and becoming rather than unity, hierarchy and being. This rhizomatic thinking led them to critique many of the basic assumptions of Western philosophy and psychology. Instead of seeing the self as a unified subject, they saw it as a collection of flows, intensities and connections that are constantly changing. Instead of looking for the deep structures that supposedly underlie surface phenomena, they focused on the surfaces themselves and the complex interactions between different elements. The Science Wars. The postmodern challenge to traditional forms of knowledge was not limited to philosophy and the humanities. Beginning in the 1970s, a new field called science studies emerged that applied sociological and anthropological methods to the study of scientific knowledge. These scholars argued that scientific facts are not simply discovered, but are constructed through social processes involving negotiation, persuasion, and the exercise of power. This social constructionist approach to science was deeply influenced by Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions, which had shown how scientific paradigms are established and overthrown through processes that involve social and psychological factors, as well as purely logical considerations. Science studies scholars like Bruno Latour, Steve Woolgar, and Karin Nor-Cetina conducted detailed ethnographic studies of scientific laboratories, showing how scientific facts are assembled through complex networks of human and non-human actors. These studies revealed that the clean, rational image of science presented in textbooks bore little resemblance to the messy, contingent processes by which scientific knowledge is actually produced. Scientists do not simply observe nature and report what they see, but must actively construct their objects of study through the use of instruments, techniques, and theoretical frameworks. The facts that emerge from this process are not pure reflections of natural reality, but are shaped by the social and material conditions of their production. This social constructionist approach to science was seen by many scientists as a direct attack on the objectivity and rationality of scientific knowledge. If scientific facts are socially constructed, critics argued, then science becomes just another form of opinion or ideology with no special claim to truth. This led to what became known as the Science Wars, a heated debate between scientists and science studies scholars about the nature and status of scientific knowledge. The Science Wars reached their peak with the Sokal affair in 1996. Alan Sokal, a physicist at New York University, submitted a paper titled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity to Social Text, a leading cultural studies journal. The paper was filled with postmodern jargon and made extravagant claims about the social construction of scientific knowledge, but it was actually a hoax designed to test whether the journal would publish nonsense as long as it was dressed up in fashionable theoretical language. When Social Text published the paper, Sokal revealed his hoax in another journal, arguing that it demonstrated the intellectual bankruptcy of postmodern approaches to science. He claimed that postmodern theorists were making absurd statements about physics and mathematics based on superficial misunderstandings of these fields. The affair generated enormous controversy and was seen by many as evidence that postmodernism had gone too far in its critique of scientific rationality. However, defenders of science studies argued that Sokal's hoax was based on a misunderstanding of their actual claims. They were not arguing that natural reality does not exist, or that scientific theories are completely arbitrary. Rather, they were trying to understand how scientific knowledge is produced and validated within particular social and institutional contexts. They pointed out that even the most objective scientific facts must be communicated through language and symbols, which inevitably involve processes of interpretation and construction. The Science Wars revealed deep tensions between different approaches to understanding knowledge and truth. On one side were those who defended the traditional view of science as an objective method for discovering truths about the natural world. On the other side were those who argued for a more contextual and social understanding of how knowledge is produced and validated. These debates continue today in discussions about climate change, evolution, and other controversial scientific topics. Feminist philosophy emerges. One of the most important developments in late 20th century philosophy was the emergence of feminist philosophy as a distinct area of inquiry. Feminist philosophers drew on the broader feminist movement that had gained momentum in the 1960s and 1970s, but they also developed sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding how gender shapes philosophical thinking and how traditional philosophy has excluded or marginalized women's perspectives. The roots of feminist philosophy can be traced back to earlier thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir, whose book The Second Sex had analysed women's situation as the other in relation to male-dominated society. But it was not until the 1970s that feminist philosophy emerged as a recognised field with its own journals, conferences, and institutional presence within academic philosophy. One of the pioneering figures in this development was Carol Gilligan, a psychologist who challenged the masculine bias in theories of moral development. Gilligan's work began as a critique of Lawrence Kohlberg's influential theory of moral reasoning, which was based on studies of boys and young men. Kohlberg had identified 6 stages of moral development, with the highest stage involving abstract reasoning about universal principles of justice and rights. But when Gilligan studied girls and women, she found that they often reasoned about moral problems in different ways. Rather than focusing on abstract principles and individual rights, women tended to emphasize relationships, care and responsibility for particular others. According to Kohlberg's theory, this meant that women were morally inferior, stuck at lower levels of development because they could not think in terms of universal principles. Gilligan argued that this conclusion revealed the masculine bias in Kohlberg's theory rather than any deficiency in women's moral reasoning. She proposed that there are actually two different moral orientations: an ethics of justice that emphasizes rights, rules, and fairness, and an ethics of care that emphasizes relationships, responsibilities, and attention to particular needs and contexts. Both orientations are valuable and necessary for a complete understanding of morality. Gilligan's work on the ethics of care had enormous influence both within and outside of philosophy. It challenged the assumption that the masculine approach to moral reasoning was universal and superior, opening up space for alternative ways of thinking about ethical problems. Care ethics became a major area of feminist philosophy, with thinkers like Nell Noddings, Virginia Held, and Joan Tronto developing sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding care as a fundamental aspect of human relationships and social organization. Miranda Fricker, a British philosopher, developed another important area of feminist philosophy through her work on epistemic injustice. Fricker was interested in understanding how social power relations affect who gets believed, whose knowledge is taken seriously, and who is seen as a credible source of information. She identified two main forms of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. Testimonial injustice occurs when someone's credibility is unfairly deflated because of negative stereotypes about their social group. For example, a woman reporting sexual harassment might not be believed because of stereotypes about women being emotional or vindictive. A person of color describing their experience of racism might be dismissed because of assumptions about their reliability or objectivity. These credibility deficits are not based on any actual evidence about the person's trustworthiness, but on prejudices and biases that systematically disadvantage certain groups. Hermeneutical injustice occurs when marginalized groups lack the conceptual resources to make sense of their experiences because the dominant interpretive frameworks have been developed by and for privileged groups. For example, the concept of sexual harassment did not exist in legal or popular discourse until the 1970s, even though the behavior it describes was common. Women who experienced unwanted sexual attention at work lacked the conceptual tools to understand and articulate what was happening to them. Fricker's work on epistemic injustice has been enormously influential in philosophy, law, psychology, and other fields. It provides a framework for understanding how social inequalities affect the production and circulation of knowledge, and it suggests ways that institutions and individuals can work to overcome these injustices. Alison Jagger, an American philosopher, made important contributions to feminist epistemology, the study of how gender affects our ways of knowing and understanding the world. Jagger argued that traditional philosophy has been based on a series of false assumptions about knowledge and knowers. It has assumed that knowledge is best produced by detached, objective observers who can transcend their particular social locations and achieve a view from nowhere. But Jagger argued that this ideal of objectivity is both impossible and undesirable. All knowledge is produced by particular people in particular social contexts, and our social locations inevitably shape what we can see and understand. Rather than trying to transcend these social influences, we should acknowledge them and use them as resources for producing better knowledge. This led Jagger to argue for what she called strong objectivity, following the work of philosopher of science Sandra Harding. Strong objectivity involves being reflexive about our own social positions and how they shape our perspective, seeking out the perspectives of marginalized groups who may see things that are invisible to those in positions of privilege, and building knowledge through dialogue and collaboration rather than individual achievement. Feminist philosophers also revealed the masculine bias in many traditional philosophical concepts and arguments. They showed how supposedly universal concepts like reason, autonomy and justice were actually modelled on masculine stereotypes and excluded feminine-associated qualities like emotion, interdependence and care. They argued for more inclusive and complex understandings of these concepts that could incorporate the full range of human experience. For example, traditional philosophical concepts of autonomy emphasized independence, self-sufficiency, and the ability to make rational choices free from external influence. But feminist philosophers pointed out that this understanding of autonomy ignored the ways that people are fundamentally interdependent and that our capacity for choice is always developed through relationships with others. They developed alternative concepts of relational autonomy that acknowledged both our independence and our interdependence. Applied ethics develops. While postmodern and feminist philosophers were challenging the foundations of traditional philosophical thinking, another important development was taking place in the practical application of philosophical ideas to real-world problems. Applied ethics emerged as a major area of philosophical inquiry in the 1960s and 1970s, responding to urgent social issues and technological developments that raised new moral questions. The development of applied ethics was driven partly by external pressures. Medical advances like organ transplantation, life support systems, and genetic testing raised difficult questions about the beginning and end of life, the allocation of scarce resources, and the rights of patients and families. Environmental destruction caused by industrial development raised questions about our obligations to future generations and non-human nature. The growth of large corporations and professional associations raised questions about the responsibilities of businesses and professionals to society. Medical ethics, or bioethics, was one of the first areas of applied ethics to develop. The field was catalyzed by several scandals involving unethical medical research, including the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which African American men were deliberately left untreated so that researchers could study the progression of the disease. These revelations led to the development of institutional review boards to oversee human subjects research and to increased attention to issues of informed consent, confidentiality, and patient rights. Bioethicists developed several influential principles for medical ethics, including autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. The principle of autonomy emphasizes the right of patients to make their own decisions about their medical care, even when healthcare providers believe those decisions are unwise. Beneficence requires healthcare providers to act in the best interests of their patients, while non-maleficence requires them to avoid causing harm. Justice requires fair distribution of medical resources and equal treatment regardless of social status. These principles provided a framework for analyzing difficult cases in medical ethics, from end-of-life care to genetic engineering to resource allocation. Bioethics became an established field with its own journals, professional organizations, and institutional presence in hospitals and medical schools. Bioethicists served on hospital ethics committees, advised policymakers on healthcare legislation, and helped develop guidelines for medical research and practice. Environmental ethics emerged as another important area of applied ethics in response to growing awareness of environmental problems. The publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, which documented the harmful effects of pesticides on wildlife and ecosystems, helped spark the modern environmental movement. The first Earth Day in 1970 brought millions of people together to call for greater environmental protection. Philosophers began to develop theoretical frameworks for understanding our moral obligations to the natural world. Traditional moral philosophy had focused almost exclusively on the relationships between human beings, but environmental philosophers argued that we also have obligations to animals, plants, ecosystems, and future generations. They developed several different approaches to environmental ethics, including animal rights theories, biocentric ethics that extend moral consideration to all living beings, and ecocentric ethics that focus on the integrity of ecological systems. Deep ecology, developed by Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, argued for a fundamental shift in how humans relate to the natural world. Rather than seeing nature as a collection of resources for human use, deep ecologists argued for recognizing the intrinsic value of all living beings and natural systems. They called for a reduction in human population and consumption, and a move towards simpler, more sustainable ways of living. Business ethics emerged as another important area of applied ethics in response to corporate scandals and growing awareness of the social and environmental impacts of business activities. The field was catalyzed by events like the Ford Pinto case, in which it was revealed that Ford Motor Company had known about a dangerous design flaw that could cause fatal fires, but had decided not to fix it because the cost of repair exceeded the expected cost of lawsuits. Business ethicists developed frameworks for analyzing the responsibilities of corporations and business professionals. They examined issues like truth in advertising, workplace safety, environmental protection, fair competition, and corporate governance. Many businesses began to develop codes of ethics and compliance programs, and business schools began to require courses in business ethics. The development of applied ethics represented a significant shift in philosophical practice. Rather than focusing primarily on abstract theoretical questions, philosophers were increasingly engaging with concrete practical problems and working to develop solutions that could be implemented in the real world. This practical turn in moral philosophy brought philosophy into closer contact with other disciplines like law, medicine, public policy, and social work. Applied ethics also raised important questions about the relationship between theory and practice in philosophy. Traditional moral theories like utilitarianism and deontology often provided conflicting guidance when applied to specific cases, leading some philosophers to develop more context-sensitive approaches to ethical decision-making. Others argued for the importance of moral emotions, character traits, and narrative understanding in addition to rational principles. The period from 1960 to 2000 thus saw philosophy undergoing major transformations in response to social and intellectual challenges. Postmodern thinkers questioned the foundations of Western thought and opened up new ways of understanding knowledge, power, and meaning. Feminist philosophers revealed the masculine bias in traditional philosophy and developed new approaches that were more inclusive of women's experiences and perspectives. Applied ethicists brought philosophical thinking to bear on urgent practical problems and helped establish philosophy as relevant to public life. These developments were not without controversy. Traditional philosophers often resisted postmodern and feminist challenges to established ways of thinking. Scientists and other scholars criticized postmodern approaches to knowledge as relativistic and anti-rational. Some philosophers worried that the emphasis on applied ethics was leading to a neglect of fundamental theoretical questions. But these debates and controversies were themselves productive, forcing philosophers to examine their assumptions and develop more sophisticated and nuanced approaches to long-standing problems. The challenges of the late 20th century ultimately enriched philosophy by expanding its scope, diversifying its methods, and increasing its relevance to broader social and cultural concerns. The philosophical landscape at the end of the 20th century was more diverse, more inclusive, and more engaged with the world than it had been at the beginning, setting the stage for continued development and transformation in the new millennium. The last decades of the 20th century and the opening years of the 21st century have witnessed philosophy undergoing yet another dramatic transformation. The intellectual landscape that had been shaped by continental and analytic traditions was suddenly disrupted by revolutionary developments in neuroscience, computer science, cognitive psychology, and environmental science. For the first time in human history, scientists could peer directly into the working brain. Computers could simulate aspects of human thinking. And the environmental crisis forced philosophers to confront questions about humanity's relationship with the natural world on a planetary scale. This period has been marked by an unprecedented explosion of new philosophical problems and approaches. Traditional boundaries between philosophy and science have become increasingly blurred, with philosophers working directly with neuroscientists, psychologists, and computer scientists. The ivory tower isolation that had characterized much academic philosophy was challenged by experimental philosophers who insisted on testing philosophical theories against empirical evidence. Meanwhile, the long dominance of Western philosophy was questioned by scholars who demanded recognition for philosophical traditions from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Perhaps most significantly, the digital revolution and the climate crisis have forced philosophers to grapple with entirely new categories of problems. Questions about artificial intelligence, virtual reality, information ethics, and environmental justice have moved from the realm of science fiction to urgent practical concerns that require sophisticated philosophical analysis. The result has been a period of extraordinary creativity and innovation in philosophical thinking. The naturalistic turn. The story of contemporary philosophy begins with a fundamental shift in how philosophers approached the mind-body problem that had puzzled thinkers since Descartes. This shift, known as the naturalistic turn, was driven by the conviction that philosophy needed to take seriously the discoveries of neuroscience and cognitive science. Instead of relying purely on conceptual analysis and thought experiments, philosophers began working directly with scientists to understand how the brain actually works. Patricia Churchland emerged as one of the most influential figures in this movement. Born in 1943 in British Columbia, Churchland initially studied philosophy in the traditional way, writing her doctoral dissertation on the philosophy of science. But she became increasingly frustrated with the abstract nature of philosophical discussions about the mind. While philosophers debated whether mental states could be reduced to brain states, neuroscientists were making remarkable discoveries about how specific brain regions contributed to memory, perception, and decision-making. Churchland's revolutionary approach was to argue for what she called eliminative materialism. This was not simply the claim that mental states are identical to brain states, but the much more radical thesis that our common-sense understanding of mental states is fundamentally mistaken. According to eliminative materialism, concepts like beliefs, desires, hopes and fears will eventually be eliminated from scientific psychology, just as concepts like phlogiston and vital force were eliminated from chemistry and biology. This might seem absurd at first glance. How could beliefs and desires not exist when we experience them every day? Churchland's answer was that our introspective awareness of our mental lives is no more reliable than our perceptual awareness of the external world. Just as science revealed that the sun does not actually revolve around the earth, despite appearances, neuroscience would reveal that the mind does not actually contain the beliefs and desires that folk psychology attributes to it. Churchland supported this argument by pointing to the long history of failed scientific theories. Medieval physicians believed that illness was caused by imbalances in 4 bodily humours. This theory seemed to make sense of many observations and guided medical practice for centuries, but it turned out to be completely wrong, and modern medicine has replaced it with theories based on bacteria, viruses and biochemistry. Similarly, Churchland argued, folk psychology might seem to make sense of human behaviour, but it could turn out to be as mistaken as the theory of humours. The implications of eliminative materialism were staggering. If beliefs and desires do not exist, then traditional moral and legal concepts that depend on these notions would need to be completely reconsidered. How could we hold people responsible for their actions if they do not really have beliefs and desires in the way we normally understand them? How could we make sense of concepts like knowledge, rationality, or even meaning itself? Churchland's husband, Paul Churchland, developed similar arguments, and together they became known as the most radical advocates of neurophilosophy. Their work sparked intense debates that continue to this day. Critics argued that eliminative materialism was self-defeating. If beliefs do not exist, then the Churchland's belief in eliminative materialism does not exist either. How could they argue for a theory that undermines the very possibility of having theories? Daniel Dennett, born in 1942 in Boston, took a somewhat different approach to naturalizing the mind, but his conclusions were equally controversial. Dennett was trained in traditional analytic philosophy at Oxford, where he studied with Gilbert Ryle, but he became convinced that philosophers needed to pay much closer attention to empirical research in psychology and neuroscience. Unlike the Churchlands, however, Dennett did not want to eliminate mental concepts altogether, but rather to explain them in naturalistic terms. Dennett's most famous book, Consciousness Explained, published in 1991, argued that consciousness is not the mysterious, ineffable phenomenon that many philosophers had taken it to be. Instead, consciousness is simply what happens when a sufficiently complex information processing system develops the ability to monitor and report on its own internal states. There is no special inner theatre where conscious experiences are displayed to some internal observer. Instead, consciousness emerges from the complex interactions of multiple parallel processes in the brain. This theory, which Dennett called the multiple drafts model, suggested that there is no single moment when a mental content becomes conscious. Instead, different parts of the brain process different aspects of incoming information, creating multiple drafts of what is happening. These drafts compete for control of behavior and verbal reports, but there is no central location where they are integrated into a unified conscious experience. Dennett's approach was deeply influenced by computational theories of mind. He argued that the mind is essentially a kind of computer, though a much more sophisticated one than any artificial computer yet built. This led him to develop what he called the intentional stance, a method for understanding and predicting behavior by attributing beliefs and desires to systems, whether they are humans, animals, or even machines. The intentional stance was not meant to claim that systems actually have beliefs and desires in some metaphysical sense. Rather, it was a useful predictive strategy. If we can successfully predict a chess-playing computer's moves by attributing to it the desire to win and beliefs about good chess strategies, then the intentional stance is justified pragmatically, regardless of whether the computer really has desires and beliefs. This pragmatic approach to mental concepts allowed Dennett to avoid the radical conclusions of eliminative materialism while still maintaining a thoroughly naturalistic worldview. Mental concepts could be preserved as useful tools for understanding behavior, even if they did not correspond to fundamental features of reality. However, not all philosophers were convinced that consciousness could be explained away so easily. David Chalmers, born in 1966 in Australia, argued that the naturalistic approaches of philosophers like Dennett and the Churchlands missed what he called the hard problem of consciousness. While these philosophers could explain the functional aspects of consciousness, such as the ability to process information, integrate sensory inputs and control behavior, they could not explain why there is something it is like to have conscious experiences. Chalmers distinguished between the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem. The easy problems, though technically difficult, were in principle solvable by neuroscience and cognitive science. They included questions about how the brain processes sensory information, how it controls attention, how it integrates information from different sources, and how it produces behavioral responses. These problems were easy, not because they were simple, but because we could see how they might be solved by discovering the neural mechanisms involved. The hard problem, by contrast, was the problem of experience itself. Why is there something it is like to see red, to taste coffee, or to feel pain? Even if we completely understood the neural mechanisms involved in colour vision, we would still not understand why colour experiences have their particular qualitative character. A complete physical description of the brain would leave out what philosophers call qualia, the intrinsic qualitative features of conscious experiences. To illustrate this point, Chalmers revived and refined a thought experiment originally developed by other philosophers, the philosophical zombie argument. A philosophical zombie would be physically identical to a normal human being in every respect. It would have the same brain structure, the same neural activity, and the same behavioral responses, but it would lack conscious experiences entirely. It would act as if it saw red when looking at a strawberry, but there would be nothing it is like for the zombie to see red. If such zombies are conceivable, Chalmers argued, then consciousness cannot be purely physical. If consciousness were nothing over and above physical processes, then a physical duplicate would necessarily be conscious. The conceivability of zombies suggests that there is an explanatory gap between physical processes and conscious experience that cannot be bridged by purely naturalistic methods. This argument sparked enormous debate in philosophy of mind. Critics argued that zombies were not really conceivable when we thought carefully about what would be involved in creating a perfect physical duplicate. Supporters argued that the zombie argument revealed fundamental limitations in physicalist approaches to consciousness. The debate continues to this day, with philosophers developing increasingly sophisticated versions of both sides of the argument. Philosophy of mind renaissance. The naturalistic turn in philosophy was accompanied by a renaissance in philosophy of mind more generally. Philosophers developed new theories and arguments that engaged seriously with empirical research while preserving the conceptual rigour that had always been philosophy's strength. This period saw the development of some of the most influential thought experiments and theoretical frameworks in the history of philosophy of mind. John Searle, born in 1932 in Denver, developed what he called biological naturalism as an alternative to both eliminative materialism and traditional dualism. Searle agreed with naturalists that consciousness must be produced by the brain, but he argued that consciousness has irreducible subjective features that cannot be captured by purely objective scientific description. Searle's most famous contribution to philosophy of mind was the Chinese room argument, developed in the 1980s as a critique of strong artificial intelligence. The argument was designed to show that computation alone could not produce understanding or consciousness. Searle asked us to imagine a person who knows no Chinese locked in a room with a comprehensive rule book written in English. The rule book tells the person how to respond to Chinese characters by manipulating other Chinese characters according to purely formal rules. Chinese speakers outside the room pass questions written in Chinese through a slot. The person in the room follows the rules to construct appropriate Chinese responses and passes them back out. From the outside, it appears that the person in the room understands Chinese perfectly. But from the inside, it is clear that the person has no understanding of Chinese at all. They are simply following rules for manipulating meaningless symbols. Searle argued that this is exactly what digital computers do. They manipulate symbols according to formal rules, but they have no understanding of what the symbols mean. Even if a computer could pass the most sophisticated tests for intelligence, it would still be nothing more than a very fast and complex symbol manipulator. Understanding and consciousness require something more than computation. They require the specific biological processes that occur in brains. This argument was enormously influential, but also highly controversial. Critics developed various responses, including the systems reply, which argued that while the person in the room might not understand Chinese, the whole system, including the person and the rule book, might understand Chinese. Supporters refined the argument and applied it to various proposed solutions to the problem of machine consciousness. Frank Jackson, an Australian philosopher born in 1943, developed another influential thought experiment that challenged physicalist theories of consciousness. Jackson's knowledge argument, also known as the Mary case, was designed to show that physical knowledge cannot capture all facts about consciousness. Mary is a brilliant scientist who has been raised from birth in a black and white room. She has never seen colours, but she has learned everything there is to know about the physics and neuroscience of colour vision. She knows all about wavelengths of light, how the eye processes visual information, and how the brain responds to different visual stimuli. She has studied the behavioral responses that people have to different colours and their verbal reports about colour experiences. The question is, when Mary finally leaves her room and sees a red tomato for the first time, does she learn anything new? Jackson argued that she clearly does. She learns what it is like to see red, something that all her previous physical knowledge could not teach her. This suggests that there are facts about consciousness, facts about what experiences are like, that cannot be captured by physical science. The knowledge argument sparked an enormous literature as philosophers tried to explain away the intuition that Mary learned something new. Some argued that Mary gains new abilities rather than new propositional knowledge. Others argued that Mary's situation is impossible because complete physical knowledge would include knowledge of her own brain states. Still others argued that Mary's new knowledge is the same old physical knowledge presented in a new way. Thomas Nagel, born in 1937 in Belgrade, developed yet another influential argument against reductive physicalism. In his famous 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, Nagel argued that consciousness poses a fundamental obstacle to the objective methods of science. Science works by adopting an objective standpoint that abstracts away from particular perspectives. But consciousness is essentially perspectival, involving what it is like to be a particular subject. Nagel used the example of bat consciousness to illustrate this point. Bats navigate using echolocation, a form of perception completely unlike human vision or hearing. We can study the physics of echolocation and the neuroscience of bat brains, but we cannot know what echolocation experiences are like for a bat. The subjective character of bat experience is beyond the reach of objective scientific methods. This does not mean that consciousness is supernatural or non-physical. Rather, it suggests that our current concepts and methods are inadequate for understanding consciousness. We need what Nagel called a conceptual revolution, comparable to the scientific revolution that gave us modern physics. Until we develop new concepts and methods, consciousness will remain mysterious. These developments in philosophy of mind were occurring against the backdrop of remarkable advances in neuroscience. Brain imaging technologies like fMRI and PET scans allowed scientists to observe the brain in action for the first time. Researchers could see which areas of the brain were active during different cognitive tasks and begin to correlate neural activity with mental phenomena. The mind-body problem in the age of neuroscience took on new urgency and complexity. Neuroscientists discovered that brain damage could produce bizarre alterations in consciousness, such as blind sight, where patients could respond to visual stimuli they claimed not to see, or split brain phenomena, where the two hemispheres of the brain seemed to support separate streams of consciousness. These discoveries raise profound questions about the unity of consciousness and the nature of the self. If consciousness could be divided or fragmented by brain damage, what did this mean for our understanding of personal identity and moral responsibility? Philosophers found themselves grappling with empirical findings that challenged their most basic assumptions about the mind. Experimental philosophy. While some philosophers were integrating their work more closely with neuroscience and cognitive science, others were questioning the methodological foundations of philosophy itself. The experimental philosophy movement, which emerged in the early 2000s, challenged the traditional reliance on intuitions and thought experiments that had characterized analytic philosophy. Experimental philosophers argued that if philosophical theories were supposed to capture our concepts and intuitions, then philosophers needed to study what people's concepts and intuitions actually were. Instead of relying on their own intuitions or those of their colleagues, philosophers should conduct empirical studies to discover what ordinary people think about philosophical questions. Joshua Knober, born in 1974, became one of the leading figures in experimental philosophy. Knobe was trained in traditional analytic philosophy, but became interested in empirical psychology and began conducting studies that revealed surprising patterns in how people think about moral and psychological concepts. One of Knobe's most famous studies involved the concept of intentional action. Philosophers had generally assumed that people attribute intentional action when someone acts with the intention of bringing about a particular outcome. But Knobe discovered that moral judgments also influence attributions of intentionality. When people disapprove of an outcome, They are more likely to say that someone brought it about intentionally, even when the person's intentions were identical to cases where people approve of the outcome. This Knobe effect suggested that folk psychology is more complex and morally laden than philosophers had realized. It raised questions about whether philosophical theories based on intuitions about intentional action were capturing something objective about the nature of action, or merely reflecting the moral biases built into our concepts. Sean Nichols, another prominent experimental philosopher, conducted studies on a wide range of philosophical topics, from free will to personal identity to moral responsibility. Nichols discovered that people's intuitions about these topics varied depending on how questions were framed, what cultural background they came from, and even what emotional state they were in when asked. For example, studies of intuitions about free will revealed that people tend to be compatibilists when thinking abstractly about determinism, believing that free will is compatible with causal determinism. But they tend to be incompatibilists when thinking about specific cases, believing that determinism rules out free will and moral responsibility. This suggested that there might not be stable folk intuitions about free will for philosophical theories to capture. The experimental philosophy movement, often called X-Fi, challenged what its proponents called armchair philosophy. Instead of developing theories from the comfort of their offices, philosophers needed to get out into the world and study how people actually think. This required learning empirical methods from psychology and anthropology and conducting careful studies with appropriate controls and statistical analysis. Critics of experimental philosophy argued that it misunderstood the nature of philosophical inquiry. Philosophy was not trying to describe how people actually think, but rather to develop normative theories about how people should think. The fact that ordinary people have confused or inconsistent intuitions did not undermine philosophical attempts to develop better concepts and theories. Supporters of experimental philosophy responded that even normative philosophical theories needed to be grounded in some understanding of human psychology and the actual use of concepts. If philosophical theories were completely divorced from how people actually think, then they would be irrelevant to real human concerns. One of the most significant findings of experimental philosophy was the discovery of cultural variation in philosophical intuitions. Studies conducted by researchers like Sean Nichols and Jonathan Weinberg found that people from different cultural backgrounds had systematically different intuitions about knowledge, causation, and moral responsibility. For example, studies of epistemic intuitions found that East Asians were less likely than Westerners to attribute knowledge in Gettier cases, scenarios where someone has a justified true belief that nevertheless seems not to count as knowledge due to lucky coincidences. This suggested that theories of knowledge based on Western intuitions might not be universally valid. These findings raised profound questions about the nature and validity of philosophical inquiry. If different cultures have different philosophical intuitions, then which intuitions should philosophers trust? Should philosophy aim to develop theories that are valid for all humans, or should it recognize that different philosophical frameworks might be appropriate for different cultural contexts? Global philosophy emerges. The discovery of cultural variation in philosophical intuitions was part of a broader recognition that philosophy had been dominated by a narrow range of cultural perspectives. For centuries, academic philosophy had been centered in Europe and North America, with little attention paid to philosophical traditions from other parts of the world. This began to change dramatically in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as philosophers demanded a more inclusive and global approach to philosophical inquiry. The movement toward global philosophy was driven by several factors. Immigration and increased cultural contact made it impossible to ignore the existence of sophisticated philosophical traditions outside the Western canon. Post-colonial critiques highlighted the ways in which Western philosophy had been used to justify domination and marginalization of other cultures. And scholars from non-Western backgrounds began demanding recognition for their own philosophical traditions. Comparative philosophy emerged as a field dedicated to bringing different philosophical traditions into dialogue with each other. Instead of treating Western philosophy as the universal standard against which other traditions should be measured, comparative philosophers try to understand different traditions on their own terms and explore what they might learn from each other. The encounter between Eastern and Western philosophy proved particularly fruitful. Buddhist concepts of no-self and interdependence offered alternatives to Western assumptions about personal identity and individual autonomy. Hindu concepts of multiple levels of reality challenged Western metaphysical frameworks. Confucian ethics of role-based relationships provided alternatives to Western emphasis on universal rights and individual autonomy. For example, the Buddhist concept of anatman, or no-self, challenged Western assumptions that personal identity depends on the continuity of the self over time. If there is no permanent self, then questions about what makes someone the same person over time need to be completely reconsidered. This had implications not just for metaphysics but for ethics, as concepts of moral responsibility and punishment assume some kind of personal continuity. African philosophy also gained increased recognition during this period. For centuries, Western scholars had denied that Africa had produced genuine philosophy, claiming that African thought was merely religious or mythological. But African scholars like John Mbiti, Kwame Gayekie and Mogobe Ramos demonstrated the existence of sophisticated philosophical traditions throughout Africa. One of the most influential concepts from African philosophy was Ubuntu, often translated as "I am because we are." Ubuntu emphasized the fundamental interconnectedness of human beings and challenged Western individualism. According to Ubuntu philosophy, a person becomes human only through relationships with others. This relational conception of personhood had profound implications for ethics, politics, and social organization. Ubuntu philosophy suggested that moral obligations arise not from abstract universal principles, but from one's relationships and position within a community. This provided an alternative to both utilitarian calculations of the greatest good for the greatest number and deontological duties based on universal moral laws. Instead, moral behavior meant fulfilling one's responsibilities to the communities that make one's existence possible. Latin American philosophy also gained increased recognition, particularly liberation philosophy, which emerged in the context of struggles against oppression and inequality. Liberation philosophers like Enrique Dussel and Gustavo Gutierrez argued that philosophy could not remain neutral in the face of injustice, but needed to take sides with the oppressed. Liberation philosophy challenged the assumption that philosophical inquiry could be purely objective and value-neutral. In contexts of extreme inequality and oppression, claims to neutrality often served to legitimize existing power structures. Instead, philosophy needed to be explicitly committed to human liberation and social transformation. This approach had methodological as well as political implications. Instead of starting with abstract theoretical questions, liberation philosophy began with the concrete experiences of oppressed people. Instead of seeking universal truths, it recognized that different social positions might require different philosophical approaches. The movement towards global philosophy was accompanied by efforts to decolonize philosophy curricula. Traditional philosophy courses had focused almost exclusively on Western thinkers from Plato to the present. But educators began incorporating perspectives from around the world, showing students that philosophical wisdom was not the exclusive property of one cultural tradition. This process of decolonization was not simply a matter of adding non-Western thinkers to existing courses. It required fundamental reconsideration of what counts as philosophy, what questions are worth asking, and what methods are appropriate for philosophical inquiry. It meant recognizing that the problems and approaches that had dominated Western philosophy might not be universal, but might reflect particular cultural assumptions and historical circumstances. Digital Age Philosophy. The emergence of digital technologies created entirely new categories of philosophical problems. The Internet, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and digital media raised questions that previous generations of philosophers could never have imagined. These technologies did not simply provide new examples for existing philosophical theories, but challenged fundamental assumptions about knowledge, reality, identity, and value. Luciano Floridi, born in 1964 in Rome, emerged as one of the leading philosophers of the digital age. Floridi argued that we were experiencing what he called the fourth revolution in human self-understanding. Just as the Copernican revolution showed that Earth was not the center of the universe, the Darwinian revolution showed that humans were not separate from nature, and the Freudian revolution showed that humans were not masters of their own minds. The digital revolution was showing that humans were not the only intelligent agents in the world. Floridi developed a comprehensive framework called information ethics for understanding moral questions in the digital age. Traditional ethics had focused on the welfare of sentient beings, but Floridi argued that we needed to expand our moral concern to include the entire infosphere, the totality of informational entities and their interactions. This meant developing new concepts of harm, rights, and responsibilities that could apply to digital as well as biological entities. Information ethics had practical implications for issues like privacy, surveillance, artificial intelligence, and digital divide. It provided frameworks for thinking about the moral status of digital agents, the ethics of data collection and use, and the responsibilities of technology companies and governments in shaping the digital environment. Nick Bostrom, born in 1973 in Sweden, developed influential theories about existential risk and the long-term future of humanity. Bostrom argued that advanced technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, posed unprecedented risks to human survival. Unlike natural disasters or even nuclear war, superintelligent artificial intelligence could potentially cause human extinction or permanent subjugation. Bostrom's work on existential risk was part of a broader philosophical movement focused on effective altruism and long-term thinking. This movement argued that moral agents should focus their efforts on reducing the most serious risks to the largest number of people over the longest time periods. From this perspective, preventing human extinction was more important than alleviating current suffering, because extinction would eliminate all future generations. One of Bostrom's most famous contributions was the simulation hypothesis, the idea that we might be living in a computer simulation created by some advanced civilization. Bostrom argued that if it becomes possible to create realistic simulations of conscious beings, then advanced civilizations would likely create many such simulations. In that case, most conscious beings would be simulated rather than biological, making it more likely that we are simulations than original biological beings. The simulation hypothesis raised profound questions about the nature of reality and our place in the universe. If we are simulations, then what we take to be the physical world might be nothing more than computational processes. This would not necessarily make our lives less meaningful, but it would require fundamental reconceptualization of concepts like causation, natural law, and the relationship between mind and matter. Philosophy of artificial intelligence became increasingly important as AI systems became more sophisticated and widespread. Philosophers grappled with questions about machine consciousness, artificial moral agency, and the ethics of creating intelligent machines. These questions had practical urgency as AI systems began making decisions that affected human lives in areas like criminal justice, healthcare, and autonomous vehicles. The question of machine consciousness was particularly challenging. If consciousness is purely a matter of information processing, as some philosophers argued, then sufficiently sophisticated AI systems might be conscious. But if consciousness requires biological processes, as others argued, then digital AI systems could never be truly conscious regardless of their behavioral sophistication. These questions had practical implications for how we should treat AI systems and how they should be designed. If AI systems could be conscious, then we might have moral obligations toward them. If they could be moral agents, then they might bear responsibility for their actions. If they could suffer, then we would need to consider their welfare in our decisions about AI development. The trolley problem, a classic thought experiment in moral philosophy, gained new relevance in the context of autonomous vehicles. The problem asks whether it is morally permissible to divert a runaway trolley to kill one person instead of 5. In the context of self-driving cars, this became a question about how autonomous vehicles should be programmed to make decisions in unavoidable accident scenarios. Should a self-driving car swerve to avoid hitting 5 pedestrians if this would result in killing the passenger? Should it prioritize the lives of children over adults or law-abiding citizens over criminals? Should these decisions be made by the car's algorithm, by the car's owner, or by society through democratic processes? The trolley problem revealed the difficulty of encoding moral principles into artificial systems and the need for public engagement with the ethical dimensions of AI development. Climate change and environmental philosophy. The growing awareness of climate change and environmental degradation created another major area of philosophical innovation. Traditional moral and political philosophy had focused primarily on relationships between humans, with little attention to humanity's relationship with the natural world. But the scale and urgency of environmental problems forced philosophers to develop new frameworks for thinking about our obligations to nature and future generations. Holmes Rolleston III, born in 1932, emerged as one of the founders of environmental ethics. Rolleston argued that nature has intrinsic value that exists independently of human interests and preferences. Traditional anthropocentric ethics treated nature merely as a resource for human use. But Rolleston argued that ecosystems, species, and even individual organisms have value in their own right. This position, known as ecocentric ethics, had radical implications for how humans should relate to the natural world. If nature has intrinsic value, then environmental destruction is wrong, even when it serves human interests. Humans have moral obligations to preserve biodiversity, protect ecosystems, and live within ecological limits regardless of the costs to human welfare. Ralston's approach drew on both scientific ecology and philosophical analysis of the concept of value. He argued that ecosystems are creative, productive systems that generate value through evolutionary processes. The complexity and beauty of natural systems provide evidence of their intrinsic worth that does not depend on human recognition or appreciation. Aldo Leopold, though he died in 1948, became increasingly influential in environmental philosophy through his posthumously published A Sand County Almanac. Leopold's land ethic proposed a fundamental expansion of moral consideration. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. This land ethic challenged the individualistic assumptions of traditional Western ethics. Instead of focusing on the rights and welfare of individual organisms, Leopold proposed that moral consideration should extend to ecological wholes, species, ecosystems and the biotic community as a whole. This biocentric approach suggested that individual organisms, including humans, have value primarily as members of larger ecological communities. The land ethic had practical implications for environmental policy and personal behavior. It suggested that activities like hunting and logging could be morally acceptable if they served the health of ecological communities, while activities that disrupted ecological integrity would be wrong, even if they served human interests. The concept of the Anthropocene, the proposed geological epoch characterized by human impact on Earth's systems, became central to environmental philosophy in the early 21st century. The Anthropocene marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and nature. Instead of being subject to natural forces beyond their control, humans had become a geological force capable of altering planetary systems. This recognition forced philosophers to reconsider basic concepts like nature, culture, and human agency. If humans were now planetary agents capable of affecting global climate, ocean chemistry, and biodiversity, then traditional distinctions between natural and artificial, wild and domesticated, nature and culture no longer seemed adequate. The Anthropocene also raised questions about human responsibility and agency on unprecedented scales. How should moral agents think about their obligations to future generations who will inherit the environmental consequences of current decisions? How should democratic institutions make decisions about global environmental problems that affect people around the world and across generations? Climate change became perhaps the most urgent environmental challenge facing philosophers and policymakers. The scale and complexity of climate change challenged traditional approaches to both ethics and politics. Climate change involved global collective action problems where individual rational behavior led to collectively irrational outcomes. It involved risks and uncertainties that exceeded normal human experience. And it involved relationships between current and future generations that challenged standard approaches to justice and responsibility. Philosophers developed various approaches to climate ethics. Some argued for utilitarian approaches that weighed the costs and benefits of climate action across all affected parties, including future generations. Others argued for rights-based approaches that focused on protecting vulnerable populations from climate harms. Still others argued for virtue ethics approaches that emphasized the character traits needed for sustainable living. The problem of intergenerational justice became particularly important in climate ethics. Current generations were imposing costs on future generations who had no voice in current decisions. This raised questions about the rights of future people and the obligations of current people to those who did not yet exist. Some philosophers argued that future generations have rights that current generations are obligated to respect. Others argued that we have duties to future generations based on relationships and responsibilities rather than rights. Still others argued that the uncertainty about future conditions made it impossible to determine specific obligations to future generations. The climate crisis also forced philosophers to reconsider the relationship between individual and collective responsibility. Climate change was caused by the collective actions of billions of people over many decades, making it difficult to assign responsibility to particular individuals or institutions. Yet addressing climate change required both individual behavior change and collective political action. This created paradoxes of climate responsibility. Individual actions like driving less or eating less meat had negligible effects on global climate, suggesting that individual climate action was pointless. But if everyone reasoned this way, then collective action would be impossible. Philosophers struggled to develop frameworks that could motivate both individual and collective climate action while recognizing the complex relationships between personal responsibility and systemic change. Contemporary philosophy from 1980 to the present has thus been characterized by unprecedented diversity, innovation, and engagement with practical problems. The naturalistic turn brought philosophy into closer contact with empirical science, leading to new insights about consciousness, knowledge, and human nature. The experimental philosophy movement challenged traditional philosophical methods and revealed the cultural specificity of philosophical intuitions. The emergence of global philosophy expanded the range of perspectives and problems that philosophers consider. The digital revolution created entirely new categories of philosophical problems related to artificial intelligence, information ethics, and virtual reality. And the environmental crisis forced philosophers to develop new frameworks for thinking about humanity's relationship with the natural world and obligations to future generations. These developments have made contemporary philosophy more diverse, more empirically informed, and more practically engaged than perhaps any previous period in its history. While this has created new opportunities for philosophical insight and social relevance, it has also created new challenges for maintaining philosophical rigor and coherence. The future of philosophy will likely depend on its ability to integrate these diverse approaches and perspectives while preserving the critical and reflective spirit that has always been philosophy's defining characteristic. Philosophy's current frontiers and future directions. The sun rises on another day in human history, and with it comes questions that would have seemed like science fiction to philosophers just decades ago. A mother sits at her kitchen table, scrolling through news about the first successful brain-computer interface, allowing a paralyzed person to control a robotic arm with their thoughts. Her teenage daughter asks whether this person is still the same individual if parts of their brain are replaced with computer chips. Meanwhile, across the world, scientists debate whether consciousness could emerge from quantum processes in the brain, while others wonder if we should grant rights to artificial intelligences that might soon think and feel as we do. These are not the musings of distant academics, but the pressing questions of our time, and philosophy finds itself at the centre of humanity's most challenging conversations. Emerging areas of inquiry. The story of modern philosophy begins with technology reshaping what it means to be human. When the first person receives a genetic modification that makes them immune to a hereditary disease, we celebrate a medical triumph. But when that same technology could enhance intelligence, strength, or longevity far beyond natural human limits, we enter uncharted philosophical territory. The philosophy of technology and human enhancement asks fundamental questions about the nature of human identity and flourishing. If we can cure blindness with artificial eyes that see better than natural ones, should we? If we can eliminate aging, do we have a moral obligation to do so? Or would immortality fundamentally change what makes life meaningful? Consider the story of Sarah, a fictional but representative case. Born with a genetic condition that causes gradual muscle weakness, she participates in an experimental treatment that replaces her damaged genes with healthy ones. The treatment works, but it also enhances her physical capabilities beyond normal human levels. Is Sarah still human in the traditional sense? Has she become something new? These questions matter because they affect how we understand ourselves and our obligations to future generations. Philosophers like Julian Savulescu argue that we have moral obligations to enhance our children when possible, while others like Michael Sandel worry about the hubris of seeking to master human nature itself. The emerging field of neuroethics wrestles with discoveries that challenge our most basic assumptions about moral responsibility and free will. When neuroscientist Benjamin Libet discovered in the 1980s that brain activity indicating a decision begins several hundred milliseconds before people report being aware of their intention to move, he opened a door that philosophers are still walking through. Recent advances in brain imaging allow researchers to predict with startling accuracy what choices people will make before the individuals themselves are conscious of their decisions. This raises profound questions about the nature of moral responsibility. If our brains decide before our conscious minds catch up, are we truly responsible for our actions? The story becomes more complex when we consider how this knowledge affects criminal justice. Should we hold someone less responsible for a crime if brain scans reveal abnormalities in regions associated with impulse control? Some philosophers and legal scholars argue for a more nuanced understanding of responsibility that takes neurological factors into account, while others worry that reducing moral agency to brain states undermines the foundation of human dignity and legal systems. Philosophy of quantum mechanics represents another frontier where ancient questions meet cutting-edge science. The strange world revealed by quantum physics challenges our basic intuitions about reality. Particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed, suggesting that consciousness might play a fundamental role in determining reality. Some interpretations, like the many worlds theory, propose that every quantum event splits reality into multiple universes, each containing different outcomes. If this is true, there might be countless versions of you reading different versions of this text in parallel universes. These ideas sound like fantasy, but they emerge from serious scientific research and have profound philosophical implications. If multiple universes exist, what does this mean for ethics? If every possible action occurs in some universe, are we responsible for the choices we make in this one? Philosophers like David Lewis argued for the reality of possible worlds, while others maintain that only our experienced reality matters morally. The debate continues as quantum technologies like quantum computers and quantum communication become practical realities. Space ethics and astrobiology philosophy emerge as humanity prepares to become a multi-planetary species. When the first human settlement is established on Mars, we face questions that previous generations could only imagine. Do we have the right to terraform other planets, fundamentally altering their environments to suit human needs? If we discover microbial life on Mars, does it have rights that would limit our colonization efforts? What obligations do Earth-based humans have to space colonists and vice versa? The search for extraterrestrial intelligence raises even deeper questions. If we encounter alien civilizations, how do we communicate across vastly different evolutionary histories and possibly incompatible forms of consciousness? Would aliens have rights similar to humans, or might their rights be fundamentally different based on their nature? Some philosophers argue that intelligence itself, regardless of its biological or artificial substrate, deserves moral consideration. Others maintain that rights emerge from specific relationships and shared experiences that might be impossible across species or planetary boundaries. Methodological developments. The tools philosophers use to explore these questions are themselves evolving rapidly. Computer-assisted philosophy represents a methodological revolution comparable to the invention of writing or printing. Sophisticated software can now analyze logical arguments for consistency, search vast databases of philosophical texts for patterns and connections, and even generate new philosophical arguments based on established premises. Consider how artificial intelligence changes the practice of philosophy itself. Large language models can engage in philosophical dialogue, raise objections to arguments, and explore implications of different positions. While these systems do not replace human philosophers, they serve as powerful thinking partners, helping researchers explore ideas more thoroughly and discover connections they might have missed. Some philosophers worry that this technological assistance might diminish the essentially human nature of philosophical inquiry, while others embrace these tools as natural extensions of human reasoning capacity. The integration of philosophy with cognitive science and psychology transforms how we approach traditional questions. Rather than relying solely on intuition and logical analysis, philosophers increasingly draw on empirical research about how people actually think and make moral judgments. This approach, known as experimental philosophy, studies how ordinary people respond to philosophical thought experiments and what their responses reveal about the nature of concepts like knowledge, justice, and moral responsibility. For example, philosophers have long debated whether knowledge requires certainty or whether justified true belief is sufficient. Experimental philosophers design studies to test how people actually use the concept of knowledge in different contexts. Their findings suggest that people's willingness to attribute knowledge depends partly on the stakes involved and the person's cultural background. These discoveries do not necessarily settle philosophical debates, but they provide important data about the concepts we are trying to understand. Cross-cultural and comparative approaches challenge the assumption that philosophical problems and solutions are universal. While certain questions seem to arise in every human culture, the ways different traditions approach these questions vary significantly. Chinese philosophy emphasizes harmony and social relationships in ways that contrast with Western focus on individual rights and logical argumentation. Indigenous philosophies often integrate spiritual and ecological perspectives that challenge sharp distinctions between mind and nature, self and community. The globalization of philosophical dialogue creates opportunities for unprecedented cross-pollination of ideas. When African philosophers like Kwame Gyekye explore concepts of personhood that emphasize community relationships, or when Buddhist philosophers like the Dalai Lama engage with neuroscientists about the nature of consciousness, They contribute perspectives that enrich philosophical understanding for everyone. This global conversation reveals both universal human concerns and culturally specific ways of addressing them. Persistent questions in new forms. The ancient question of personal identity takes on new urgency in the digital age. If consciousness could be uploaded to a computer, would the resulting digital being be you or merely a copy? This is not merely science fiction speculation, but a serious philosophical problem with practical implications as brain-computer interfaces become more sophisticated. Some philosophers argue that continuity of memory and personality would preserve identity across the transition from biological to digital existence. Others maintain that the physical substrate of consciousness is essential to personal identity, making uploading impossible rather than merely difficult. The story of gradual replacement illustrates the complexity of the problem. Imagine a person whose biological neurons are slowly replaced, one by one, with functionally identical artificial neurons. At what point, if any, does the person cease to exist and become replaced by an artificial being? If the replacement preserves all mental functions and memories, many philosophers argue that personal identity continues uninterrupted. But if the artificial neurons are then copied to create multiple identical beings, which one has the stronger claim to be the original person? Free will and moral responsibility face new challenges from advancing neuroscience. As brain imaging technology improves, researchers gain increasingly detailed pictures of the neural processes underlying decision-making. Some studies suggest that criminal behavior correlates with abnormalities in brain regions associated with impulse control and moral reasoning. This raises difficult questions about justice and punishment. Should society treat neurologically abnormal individuals differently in the criminal justice system? Can someone be held fully responsible for actions that emerge from brain states they did not choose? The challenge becomes more acute as we develop technologies that could directly influence brain function. If we can treat depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions by stimulating specific brain regions, we might also be able to enhance moral behavior, increase empathy, or reduce aggressive tendencies. Some philosophers argue that such interventions could be morally required in certain cases, while others worry about the implications of technological control over human nature and moral agency. The nature of consciousness remains one of philosophy's most persistent puzzles, now complicated by the possibility of artificial general intelligence. As machine learning systems become more sophisticated, they exhibit behaviors that seem increasingly intelligent and even creative. Current AI systems can engage in complex conversations, solve novel problems, and produce original artistic works. But do they experience consciousness in the way humans do? Or are they merely sophisticated information processing systems without inner subjective experience? This question matters because consciousness seems intimately connected to moral status. Most people intuitively believe that conscious beings deserve moral consideration in ways that non-conscious entities do not. If artificial intelligence systems develop genuine consciousness, they might deserve rights and protections similar to those we extend to humans and other sentient animals. But determining whether an artificial system is truly conscious, rather than merely behaving as if it were conscious, presents enormous challenges. Justice and rights face new complexities in global and intergenerational contexts. Climate change represents perhaps the greatest challenge to traditional approaches to justice, as the actions of people today affect not only others around the world, but also future generations not yet born. How do we balance the needs and rights of present people against those of future people? What obligations do wealthy nations that contributed disproportionately to historical emissions have toward poorer nations that suffer disproportionately from climate impacts? The global nature of modern challenges requires expanding our moral imagination beyond traditional boundaries of nation, culture, and even species. Some philosophers argue for the rights of future generations, maintaining that we have strong obligations to leave them a habitable planet and sustainable institutions. Others focus on global justice, arguing that arbitrary facts about where people are born should not determine their life prospects. These perspectives challenge comfortable assumptions about the limits of moral obligation and the scope of justice. Philosophy increasingly steps out of university classrooms and into public life. Public philosophy brings philosophical tools and insights to broader audiences through popular books, podcasts, and media appearances. Philosophers like Michael Sandel draw large audiences for courses on justice and ethics, while others like Martha Nussbaum influence public policy discussions about education and international development. This public engagement reflects both opportunity and responsibility as philosophical ideas shape how societies address complex challenges. Philosophical counseling offers individuals help with life's fundamental questions outside traditional therapeutic frameworks. Rather than focusing primarily on psychological symptoms, philosophical counselors help people examine their values, explore the meaning and purpose of their lives, and develop coherent worldviews. This practice, growing in popularity worldwide, demonstrates philosophy's continued relevance to personal human concerns, even in an age of scientific and technological sophistication. Philosophy's influence on policy-making and bioethics committees reveals its practical importance in democratic societies. When governments establish committees to advise on issues like genetic engineering, artificial intelligence regulation, or end-of-life care, they regularly include philosophers alongside scientists, lawyers, and other experts. Philosophers contribute distinctive skills in clarifying concepts, identifying underlying assumptions, and exploring the ethical implications of different courses of action. The teaching of critical thinking represents one of philosophy's most important social contributions. In an era of information overload and rapid technological change, the ability to analyze arguments, identify logical fallacies, and think clearly about complex problems becomes increasingly valuable. Philosophy courses teach students not just what to think, but how to think more effectively about any subject they encounter. Philosophy's relationship with social media and public discourse reveals both promise and peril. Online platforms enable philosophical conversations to reach unprecedented audiences and include voices previously excluded from academic discussions. But the same platforms can oversimplify complex ideas, promote polarization, and reward sensationalism over careful reasoning. Some philosophers embrace social media as a democratizing force, while others worry about its effects on the quality of public reasoning and debate. Looking back across 25 centuries of philosophical inquiry, certain themes emerge with remarkable consistency. Every human culture asks fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the sources and limits of knowledge, the foundations of ethics, and the meaning of existence. While the specific forms these questions take vary across cultures and historical periods, their persistence suggests something essential about human nature itself. The ancient Greeks wondered whether reality consists of permanent substances or constant change, whether knowledge comes from reason or experience, and whether virtue can be taught. Contemporary philosophers ask whether quantum mechanics reveals the fundamental indeterminacy of reality, whether artificial intelligence could achieve genuine understanding, and whether moral enhancement technologies could make people more virtuous. The questions evolve, but they remain recognizably connected to enduring human concerns. Each historical period reframes eternal questions in the context of its own challenges and opportunities. Medieval philosophers integrated Greek philosophy with religious revelation. Islamic philosophers preserved and extended classical learning during Europe's Dark Ages. And Enlightenment thinkers emphasized reason and individual rights in response to religious warfare and political oppression. Contemporary philosophers address questions shaped by scientific discoveries, technological capabilities, and global challenges that previous generations could not have imagined. The dialogue between philosophical traditions reveals both universal human concerns and the value of diverse perspectives. When contemporary philosophers engage with ancient texts, they often discover insights that remain relevant despite vast changes in context. Aristotle's analysis of friendship speaks to contemporary questions about social media relationships. Confucian emphasis on social harmony offers alternatives to individualistic approaches to ethics. And Buddhist understanding of suffering provides resources for addressing modern mental health challenges. Philosophy's unique contribution to human understanding lies not in providing final answers, but in teaching us to ask better questions and think more clearly about whatever challenges we face. While science tells us how the world works and technology gives us tools to change it, philosophy helps us think about what changes we should make and why. This contribution becomes more rather than less important as our technological capabilities expand and our choices have increasingly global and long-term consequences. Why philosophy matters more than ever. The complexity of contemporary global challenges demands the kind of conceptual clarity that philosophy specializes in providing. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and global inequality are not merely technical problems with technical solutions. They involve fundamental questions about values, rights, responsibilities, and the kind of future we want to create. Addressing these challenges effectively requires not just scientific knowledge and technological innovation, but wisdom about how to use our knowledge and power well. The rapid pace of technological advancement makes philosophical reflection more urgent rather than less relevant. Every new technology brings both opportunities and risks, and we need frameworks for thinking about how to maximize benefits while minimizing harms. Philosophy provides tools for analyzing these trade-offs and considering their implications across different communities and timescales. The need for wisdom in technological advancement becomes apparent when we consider specific examples. Gene editing technologies like CRISPR could eliminate hereditary diseases, but also create new forms of inequality if enhancement becomes available only to the wealthy. Artificial intelligence could solve many human problems, but also eliminate jobs, concentrate power, and potentially pose existential risks if not developed carefully. Social media connects people across the globe, but also enables manipulation, surveillance, and the spread of misinformation. Philosophy's role in maintaining human values amid rapid change involves both preserving what is essential about human nature and adapting our understanding to new circumstances. Some values, like the importance of human dignity and the value of truth, seem to transcend particular historical contexts. Others, like specific conceptions of family structure or economic organization, may need revision as circumstances change. Philosophy helps us distinguish between core values worth preserving and specific practices that may need updating. The continued relevance of ancient insights surprises many people who assume that old ideas become obsolete as knowledge advances. But human nature changes much more slowly than technology, and many of the challenges we face today are variations on persistent human themes. Stoic philosophy's emphasis on focusing attention on what we can control offers valuable guidance for dealing with contemporary anxiety and information overload. Confucian ideals of education and social responsibility provide alternatives to purely individualistic approaches to success and achievement. The future of philosophical inquiry. New questions arising from scientific and technological development ensure that philosophy will have plenty of work in the centuries ahead. As we develop more sophisticated technologies for reading and influencing brain activity, we will need to think more carefully about the nature of mental privacy and cognitive liberty. As we establish permanent settlements beyond Earth, we will need to develop new frameworks for thinking about environmental ethics and political organization in space. As we create increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligences, we will need to refine our understanding of consciousness, rights, and moral responsibility. The globalization of philosophical dialogue promises to enrich philosophical understanding by bringing together insights from different cultural traditions. As communication technologies make it easier for philosophers worldwide to collaborate, we can expect to see new synthetic approaches that combine the best insights from different traditions. This global conversation will likely reveal both universal aspects of human nature and valuable diversity in approaches to persistent human questions. Philosophy's integration with other disciplines will continue to deepen as the boundaries between traditional academic fields become more porous. Philosophers increasingly collaborate with scientists, economists, legal scholars, and policymakers to address complex real-world problems. This interdisciplinary collaboration does not diminish philosophy's distinctive contribution, but rather demonstrates its relevance to practical human concerns. The eternal human need to ask why and how we should live ensures that philosophy will remain relevant as long as humans exist. No matter how much we learn about the world or how sophisticated our technologies become, we will still face questions about meaning, purpose, and value that cannot be answered by science alone. The specific forms these questions take will continue to evolve, but the underlying human drive to understand ourselves and our place in the universe appears to be as fundamental as any aspect of human nature. As we stand at the threshold of unprecedented technological capabilities and global challenges, philosophy's ancient mission of helping humans think clearly about fundamental questions becomes more important than ever. The next chapter of human history will be written not just by scientists and engineers, but by all of us as we collectively decide what kind of future to create. Philosophy cannot make these decisions for us, but it can help us make them more thoughtfully and wisely. In that ongoing human conversation about how we should live together on this planet and beyond, philosophy will continue to play an essential role, asking the questions that help us remain human, even as we transcend the limitations that once defined us.